Hey, this is day 10, I believe, of my 14-day isolation here in Japan. And it also happens to be a new year, so I thought it would be a good opportunity to do a 2020 recap. I've got a slideshow at the end for anyone who wants to jump to that. I'll throw a timestamp in the description. I'm not going to talk so much about personal growth as I am about my experiences in 2020. There's a lot of people saying, fuck 2020 and screw that year, let's forget it, scratch it off the record. That really goes against everything I believe in, to be honest. It's easy for me to say this because I didn't lose a job or immediate family member, and for that I'm very grateful. I did, however, spend my birthday, Christmas, and New Year's in isolation, which for me was okay, but for a lot of people would be very difficult. But I really believe what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think there's a lot to reflect on in 2020, and there's a lot to use for your personal growth rather than resentment. After spending Christmas trekking alone in Nepal in 2019, I actually made it to India just in time for the New Year's, and that's where I started my journey in 2020. At that point, everything was normal, and I spent about a month there before flying to Malaysia on January 25th. And this is where COVID-19 really started to be real for me. Most of my friends back home and in North America, Europe, really wouldn't be affected so severely until I would say mid-March, early April. And at this point, the vibe I was getting a lot of was, oh, that's an Asia virus or a Chinese problem. Maybe not in those terms exactly, but that was really the sentiment I got from back home. Whereas being in Asia myself, the threat was a lot more real all of a sudden. There's no way to sugarcoat this, but I really did notice a increase in racism and discrimination in not just Malaysia, but around the world, as people sort of really did call this the Chinese virus. Malaysia has a huge Chinese population, and it was very apparent that people were avoiding the Chinese areas and, as a tourist, telling me not to go there. And which I ignored, to be honest, because I believed, and I still believe, that I was just as likely to catch this virus from anybody, not just because they work in a Chinese restaurant. Anyone in Malaysia was likely to be susceptible because anyone can travel to and from China, for the most part, in that area. Don't get me wrong, not everyone was like this, but it was definitely apparent in the people around me and in the media and in the way that the world media was portraying this virus. However, that was still early stages and cases were few and far between outside of China, so my travels in Malaysia were mostly unaffected. It wasn't until I flew to Korea on February 7th that my travels were really impeded by COVID-19. It was at this point that I got a lot of messages from friends and families back home asking me when I was coming home, if I was going to turn tail and run. Why am I not in Canada? Why have I not returned? And I had to ask myself a very real question. And the question was, if things take a turn for the worst, am I okay being stuck here in Korea, being stuck in Asia for the foreseeable future? And as it turned out, my answer was yes. And I had no job to return to and no home to return to in Canada. So it was a easier decision for me than it would have been for some people, but it was still a very sobering decision to decide that I might be stuck here in this foreign country where I don't speak the language. Eventually, I would end up stuck in Japan, but I'll get to that in a minute. First, I want to talk a bit about my experience in Korea. I was there in Seoul when the cases in South Korea went from about 50 to 800 in the span of little under a week, and South Korea became the country with the second most number of active cases after China. They would later handle the virus quite well, actually, but at that point in time, it was a very scary country to be in. I have many friends from Europe there with me at the time, and most of their family and friends were messaging them, hey, come back home, come back to Italy, come back to Germany. And ironically, in the span of just a few weeks, they would be telling them the complete opposite. Please stay in Korea, it is so much safer there. It was here really that wearing a mask became a normal thing for me, an everyday occurrence. Something that a lot of North Americans are still struggling with because it's an odd concept, an important concept, don't get me wrong, but definitely a change of pace. And I hate to admit it, but my social distancing and social awareness skills were lacking. And I did feel the cases were low, even as they were on the rise to 800. That's still, compared to what they are now, nothing. And I felt the government was doing what they could and had it contained. So I was still going to restaurants and bars and clubs. Not all the time, but I was still going out. Now, to tell you a little bit about what happened around Korea, which you wouldn't see on the news, I'm not quite sure how to put this, but really foreigners were subject to a lot more security measures than Koreans were. And by that I mean, to go to a bar or a club, as a foreigner, I had to bring my passport and prove that I didn't have a stamp from China. Otherwise, they wouldn't let me in. And everyone was subject to temperatures. That was normal. But there was an extra step for anyone that was visibly a foreigner. Now, I mean, I'm a white male. I'm not going to cry discrimination. That's not fair at all. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to state the facts. And the fact was, I was subject to extra measures based on the color of my skin. Which is funny to me because as a North American, like Canadian or American, it's actually a lot harder to visit China than it would be if I was Korean. Their visa opportunities are much more streamlined. But as the situation continued to deteriorate and flights around the world really did begin to be restricted, I took a look and I saw that Japan was blocking anyone who'd been to Daegu. There was a big cult in Daegu that had an outbreak of the virus. It's one of the reasons South Korea's numbers spiked so rapidly in a short span of time. And when Japan blocked people who had been to Daegu in the last 2 weeks, I said, okay, this is getting serious. I'm going to go to Japan earlier than I planned because I want to see the cherry blossoms there in March. And I decided I would rather be stuck there than in Korea. And as it actually turned out, I booked a flight the next weekend and I got one of the last flights from Korea to Japan before they completely closed that travel channel. Now, because the Japanese constitution is a bit different than others, you can't actually force people into isolation. You can't mandate them to be stuck inside like you can in some other countries. So social pressures were very high, but actual restrictions were rather low. And don't get me wrong, there was plenty of restrictions on businesses, there was a lot of closures, and it was a very different experience in Japan than I've had in the past when you can do all the normal tourist things. But for me, I was trying to look at the silver lining, and I will admit that as a photographer, it was an amazing opportunity to take photos of nature and many spots throughout Kyoto, for example, that are normally packed with tourists, and because of COVID-19, there was very few people around. Because I was stuck there, it was relatively easy to extend my normal 3-month tourist visa into a 6-month visa. I had to go to the embassy and pay a small fee, but it was very easy because flights between Japan and Canada were very limited and few and far between at that point. I won't talk too much because I've rambled on a bit, but I will say I continued to stay in Japan until August, almost 6 months until flights between Canada and Japan did open up again, and I was able to book a flight from Tokyo to Vancouver with relative ease. Arriving back in Canada, I had to isolate for 14 days, and it was a much different experience than when I left. At that point in time, I hadn't seen my family or friends in over a year, and I was very grateful to be able to return to Canada. Maybe not in the way that I had originally intended, but I did want to return, and I did want to visit those people I hadn't seen in a long time. And now I didn't get to visit everyone because of the coronavirus and the restrictions and the bubble that was put in place. There are a lot of friends. I'm back here in Japan, actually, but I will get to that. There were a lot of friends in Canada that I didn't get to see because of the restrictions. But I'm still very grateful for those of you who I did get to see, and the family that I did get to spend a bit of time with, however limited. After spending time in Canada and mostly being locked indoors, I did get a chance to go to Edmonton from Vancouver, which is, if you know Canada, it's a bit of a distance, but I was able to see my sister and my niece, which I'm very grateful for. And along the way, I was able to stop in Banff and take some photos there too. But overall, in the coming months, I was stuck inside, and I really wasn't doing much in Canada that I couldn't be doing anywhere else. So in late October, when the borders between Canada and Japan opened again for students, Japan has started to let students and other residents back into the country from restricted places. I jumped back on a flight in December, and I'm actually back here in Japan isolating. And the funny part is, once again, I've got one of the last flights because starting January 4th, due to the new strain of COVID that's going around, Japan is once again locking out all these flights that they opened up at the end of October. So I got in this 2-month window where I'm able to be back here and isolating before I start as a student studying in Japan. And I think it really was the fact that I was stuck here for 6 months that made me realize Japan's a place I'd really like to spend more of my life. And this realization has led me to make big changes in my life and take opportunities that maybe I wouldn't have taken if COVID had not been a thing. There were many hardships for me and many more hardships for others around the world, and I realized that. However, I really do think 2020 was a year for self-reflection and growth and experiences, and it is a year you can come out of with a lot more than you think if you look at it positively. And I'm excited to continue this adventure in 2021 here in Japan. I kind of glossed over a lot of stuff, but if you have any questions, or if you want to know my experience in any of these different countries during this time, please just send me a message or throw it in the comments and I'll be happy to answer your questions. I think I've rambled on enough, so here's a bit of footage from my adventure this past year. Happy New Year's.